In the gilded, claustrophobic spring of 1839, the 19-year-old Queen Victoria stood at the very pinnacle of the world. A tiny, defiant figure draped in the immense velvet robes of the British monarchy. Yet beneath the diamonds and the deference, she remained a terrified girl, haunted by a childhood of exquisite loneliness and clinging desperately to the only emotional anchor she had ever known in the turbulent sea of politics, her first Prime Minister. Lord Melbourne. To the public, Victoria was the Virgin Queen, the fresh face of a new era who had banished the debauchery of her wicked uncles, but in the private, hushed corridors of Buckingham Palace, she was a young woman frantically building a fortress around her heart. Having just escaped the draconian, Kensington system, of her mother, a regime of psychological imprisonment where she had slept in her mother's room every night until the very day of her accession. For 2 intoxicating years, Lord Melbourne, Lord M, as she affectionately called him in her diaries, had been her savior, her father figure, and her private tutor in the art of sovereignty. He was a man of effortless, cynical charm, a Whig aristocrat with a tragic past and a sparkling wit who had captivated the young queen, turning the dry business of state into a delightful courtship of the mind. He surrounded her with ladies of his own political party, the wives and sisters of prominent Whigs, creating a household that was not merely a court, but a warm, protective cocoon where every face was a friendly one, every whisper was loyal, and every influence was carefully curated to shield her from the harsh winds of opposition. To Victoria, these ladies, the Duchess of Sutherland, Lady Normanby, and others, were not political appointees or pawns on a chessboard. They were her sisters, her confidants, the very fabric of her daily existence, the women who brushed her hair, buttoned her dresses, and listened to her secrets in the intimate sanctuary of the Royal Bedchamber, a space she regarded as sacred and inviolable, utterly separate from the cold, masculine world of Parliament. But in May 1839, the idyll was shattered. The Whig government, battered by scandal and losing its grip on power, collapsed, and Lord Melbourne, with a heavy heart and a tear in his eye, came to the Queen to offer his resignation, advising her that she must now send for the leader of the Conservative opposition, Sir Robert Peel. The news struck Victoria with the force of a physical blow, plunging her into a state of panic that bordered on hysteria. The thought of losing Melbourne was not just a political inconvenience. It was an emotional amputation, a terrifying abandonment that threatened to cast her back into the isolation she had feared all her life. She wept openly, her grief raw and unchecked, terrified by the prospect of facing Peel, a man she had met only briefly and whom she loathed with the irrational intensity of youth, where Melbourne was witty, handsome, and relaxed. Peel was the son of a cotton spinner, a cold, awkward, and deeply serious man with a nervous manner and a dancing master's leg, devoid of the aristocratic grace that Victoria so admired. A man she described in her diary with devastating cruelty as such a cold, odd man. I don't like his manner. He is so shy it makes me shy. When Sir Robert Peel arrived at Buckingham Palace to kiss hands and form a new government, he walked into a trap of emotional dynamite that he was utterly ill-equipped to defuse. He saw before him not a grieving girl, but the sovereign of the realm, and he approached the task with the rigid, logical mind of a statesman, unaware that he was stepping onto the battlefield of a woman's heart. Peel looked at the royal household and saw a political anomaly, the Queen was entirely surrounded by the wives, daughters, and sisters of his political enemies, the Whigs, meaning that every conversation he had with the monarch, every strategy he proposed, would be whispered into the ears of the very men trying to destroy his government before the sun went down. To Peel, struggling to form a minority government with a hostile House of Commons, it was a constitutional necessity that he demonstrate the Crown's confidence in his administration. He could not govern if the Queen's own bedroom was the headquarters of the opposition. And so, with a clumsiness that would echo through history, he made his request, a request that was standard, logical, and politically sound. He asked the Queen to dismiss some of the ladies of the bedchamber, specifically those most closely related to the outgoing Whig ministers, and replace them with the wives of conservatives. He did not ask to remove her personal friends or the lower-ranking maids of honor. Only the great ladies of political influence, but to Victoria, listening with widening eyes and a hardening heart, this was not a request for a sign of confidence, it was a personal violation. A monstrous intrusion into her private life that resurrected the trauma of her childhood. In her mind, Peel was not a prime minister asking for support, he was another Sir John Conroy. Another tyrannical male figure trying to strip her of her friends, isolate her in her own home, and surround her with spies who would watch her every move with critical, unfriendly eyes. The transformation in the room was instantaneous, the weeping girl vanished, replaced by the granddaughter of George III, her eyes flashing with the stubborn, immovable fire of the Hanoverians. She drew herself up to her full height, barely 5 feet, yet radiating an aura of terrifying authority, and told the startled Peel that she would not give up a single one of her ladies. Not one, and that his request was contrary to usage and repugnant to my feelings. Peel, flustered and confused by this wall of emotional granite, tried to reason with her, explaining the fragility of his position, pleading that he only wanted to remove the ladies of the bedchamber, and not the others. But Victoria, seizing on the terminology with the pedantic fury of a teenager winning an argument, refused to listen to distinctions. To her, it was a battle for her autonomy, a fight to prove that she was the queen regnant, not a puppet to be managed by gray-haired men in frock coats. She viewed the bedchamber not as a state institution, but as her home, and she would defend its threshold with the ferocity of a lioness protecting her cubs. The standoff that followed was a piece of high political theater that brought the machinery of the British Empire to a grinding, screeching halt, for hours, and then for days. The most powerful men in the world, Peel, the Duke of Wellington, and the entire Conservative leadership, found themselves paralyzed by the will of a 19-year-old girl who simply refused to say yes. Peel, desperate and out of his depth, called upon the Duke of Wellington, the hero of Waterloo and the most respected man in Europe, to intervene, hoping that the Iron Duke could talk sense into the obstinate young queen. But even Wellington, who had defeated Napoleon, found himself defeated by Victoria, when he tried to explain that the Queen was the only person in the kingdom who could not have her friends as her ministers. She retorted with a logic that was as flawless as it was naive. I have no engagement with my ladies, but I cannot give up my friends for the sake of a political party. The atmosphere in the palace was electric with tension. Letters flew back and forth between the Queen and Melbourne, who was secretly advising her from the sidelines, encouraging her defiance, a constitutionally dubious act that he would later regret, while Peel paced his rooms. lamenting that he was being asked to govern a country while fighting a war of the bedchamber. Victoria wrote in her journal with triumphant glee, describing how she had checkmated the cold Tories, reveling in her power, feeling the exhilarating rush of victory as she watched the great men of state bow and scrape and retreat before her refusal. She felt she was fighting for the memory of her father, for her rights as a woman, and for the comfort of her daily life. She did not see, or perhaps did not care, that she was dangerously blurring the lines between the monarch's personal pleasure and the nation's political stability, risking a constitutional crisis that could turn the people against the crown. On the morning of May 10, the crisis reached its climax. Sir Robert Peel, exhausted, humiliated, and unwilling to be dictated to by a court of hostile women, formally resigned his commission to form a government, declaring that he could not administer the affairs of a great empire without the demonstrative confidence of the sovereign. The Whigs, led by the weary Lord Melbourne, were recalled to office, not because they had won an election, and not because they had the support of the people, but solely because the Queen refused to change her companions. It was a victory, absolute and total. Victoria had stared down the political establishment and won, keeping her beloved Lord M by her side and her ladies in her chamber. That night, she dined in triumph, surrounded by the very women Peel had tried to remove, laughing and joking, convinced she had saved the dignity of the crown, unaware that she had actually acted with a dangerous partisanship that had alienated half her subjects. However, the Bedchamber Crisis was a victory built on sand, a fleeting moment of youthful rebellion that history would come to view not as a triumph of royal power, but as the last gasp of an archaic form of personal monarchy that was rapidly becoming obsolete. In the cold light of retrospect, Victoria's defiance was a mistake, a dangerous indulgence of personal sentiment over public duty that delayed the necessary evolution of the British government and artificially propped up a failing administration for 2 more years. The young Queen had acted with her heart, not her head, treating the premiership of Great Britain as if it were a matter of personal friendship rather than the stewardship of an empire. She had been, as she would later admit in her own journals with the brutal honesty of old age, very young and perhaps rather foolish, acknowledging that if she had been older, she would have known better than to pit her private comfort against the smooth running of the state. The true resolution to the crisis would not come from a politician, but from the arrival, mere months later, of Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, the serious, intellectual German cousin who would become her husband and, eventually, the master of her household. It was Albert who would gently, firmly, and methodically dismantle the emotional fortress Victoria had built, teaching her the hard lesson that a constitutional monarch must be above party, a neutral symbol of the nation rather than a partisan player in the game of politics. He would eventually negotiate the very compromise she had so fiercely rejected, replacing the Whig ladies with neutral figures, smoothing the feathers of the Tories, and reconciling the Queen with Peel, whom she would eventually come to respect and admire as one of her greatest prime ministers, recognizing in his cold efficiency the very qualities of integrity she had once despised. But in that fevered spring of 1839, the future was still unwritten. The Bedchamber Crisis stands as a singular, crystalline moment in the long tapestry of her reign, a moment where the girl and the Queen were inextricably and disastrously one. It remains a testament to the sheer, terrifying force of personality that resided in that tiny frame. A reminder that before she was the somber widow in black or the grandmother of Europe, she was a passionate, stubborn, and deeply lonely young woman who brought the machinery of the British Empire to a halt simply because she could not bear to be alone in the dark, fighting with the only weapon she had, the majestic, unyielding power of the word no. The crisis passed, the empire moved on, but the echo of that collision, between the heart of a girl and the duty of a queen, would resonate forever in the history of the monarchy, marking the painful birth pangs of the modern age.